Talking Tolkien Podcast, Episode 7, The Silmarillion, Chapter 3, of the Coming of the Elves and the Captivity of Melkor. Alright, go ahead. Hi everyone, John Carswell here. Welcome to the Talking Tolkien Podcast, your conversational guide to Middle-earth and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. On this episode of the podcast, we resume our discussion of the Silmarillion with Chapter 3, wherein the Valar unleash some serious hurt on Melkor, and the Elves first awaken under the stars of eastern Middle-earth. Enjoy! Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of the Talking Tolkien Podcast. This is John Carswell. And I'm here with Greta, as usual. We're doing a little time traveling this week.
Are we?
Yeah.
Sweet.
Just to keep with that whole 80s movie DeLorean theme that we have going on.
Go back to the future deal.
Yeah. Unfortunately, our time travel doesn't involve a flux capacitor. It's just that episode 8 is already done, and this is only episode 7. So, yeah.
I guess that means Mad Scientist isn't going to be joining us either, huh?
Oh, Doc Brown?
Doc,
no.
That's his name. I couldn't remember.
No, Doc Brown, not going to be joining us. At least not that I expect. But you never know. You never know with Doc Brown.
You never know.
Hey, Greta, have you read my book yet?
You know what? I knew you were going to ask me that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about a clever response.
What'd you come up with?
And I came up with nothing.
Good. That's what I thought. I'm not surprised. Not surprised.
I was thinking about saying something along the lines of, have you given me a day off to do nothing but read? But that seemed more mean than funny. So I don't know why
I think this is more of a question about priorities than anything else.
All right. Okay.
So
childcare and meal planning and house cleaning, not as much a priority as reading your book.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Now that I have that on tape.
Well, you said it, not me.
But I was asking you the question, and you agreed with me.
Well, no, I'm just saying you got to do what you got to do.
Oh, alrighty.
That's all I'm saying. Well, let's ask you this other one. Did you do a topical Tolkien haiku?
Dang it! I forgot. I have the worst memory in the world.
I did 2.
Good. You're always got my back, babe.
I did one for you. So
thank you.
I'll let you pick which one you like best.
Okay.
All right. So this week we're doing Chapter 3 of the Silmarillion. There's a lot in Chapter 3. So here's the first. On seeing the elves, Orome paused. Uncanny moments are like that.
Oh, that's pretty good.
On seeing the elves, Orome paused. Uncanny moments are like that. Mm-hmm.
Remind me again what a haiku is. Is it 5?
A haiku? It's 575.
575. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That term uncanny is a really interesting term.
Seeing the elves, Orome paused. Oh, okay, never mind.
What do you think the term uncanny means?
I think the first word that popped in my head was unusual, but I think that's only part of it. I think uncanny is more just like, it has an air of like destiny or coincidence kind of baked into it.
Yeah, uncanny is one of those words to me that's kind of hard to define, but it's a very weighty word.
Yes.
And when I looked it up, it basically seemed to say like there's this level of familiarity. It's almost like deja vu.
Yes.
It's like there's this level of it's like you stumble upon something and you turn a corner and like all of a sudden there's this thing there that you weren't expecting, but it looks strangely familiar.
Right.
And it's like, oh my gosh, I'm seeing this.
Right.
You know?
Rest.
It's like hair on the back of your neck stand up kind of moment, you know, like, oh my gosh, you know, what's going on here? It's like it's like maybe like seeing a ghost that you recognize or something like that.
Yeah, which would be that's a perfect word for Orme meeting the elves.
Yeah.
Because he had, in a way, seen it before.
Yeah.
Right? In the music, in the vision.
I was looking up uncanny on Wikipedia, the term uncanny, and it's like a very deep philosophical term, apparently. Yeah. There's been a lot of ink spilled about that term. Huh. And what's really interesting is there's this phenomenon that some people have theorized called the uncanny valley. And it basically says, like, it basically talks about, like, robots. Okay. And, like, there's this spectrum of, like, as you get more and more like a human being, like as robots get more and more like human beings, like basically humans react to them. They're like okay up until a certain point, and then they reach a certain point where robots are like they could fool you if you first stumbled upon this thing and didn't know it was a robot. And it looks to the point where basically it looks so much like a human that you're like, oh, that's just another human being, and then you talk to it like, oh, that's a robot, like. So there's apparently this point at which people have really adverse reactions to robots, and it's like this tipping point, and it's called the uncanny valley.
The tipping point is called the uncanny valley.
And I was thinking about that with like Orme and the elves, that it would have maybe been like that, we were talking on our future podcast that you're going to hear in the future because this is only episode 7. We talked a little bit about how. Well, we talked about Aule and making the dwarves and how he basically what he tried to do was make what he thought elves should look like,
right?
And he didn't quite get it right, and that's why the dwarves are a little bit funny looking.
Yes.
And then we talked about with Evan on the Anna Lindley comic podcast how his figures for the Valar looked almost childlike, like they thought they were looking like they were supposed to, but they weren't quite sure exactly how they were supposed to look for the sake of the elves. Anyway, so I just really liked that word, so I'm glad I could use it in a haiku.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Kind of an interesting philosophical term. All right, do you want to hear the other haiku?
Yes.
All right. Vanyar and Noldor went straight. Teleri lingered, split by mist towers.
Okay, read that one again.
Vanyar and Noldor went straight. Teleri lingered, split by mist towers.
Okay.
You with me?
I think so. The mist towers is throwing me off.
Well, you remember the Misty Mountains?
Yes.
They mentioned the Towers of Mist.
The Towers of Mist. Yeah. I see.
Yeah. It's kind of cool to see the Towers of Mist come along and the Misty Mountains show up here because we think of that as a very Third Age thing. The Misty Mountains are the mountains that Bilbo has to cross in The Hobbit, and that's where they get trapped. They get waylaid by the orcs,
right?
And where he comes upon Gollum and gets the ring.
Mm-hmm.
Spoiler alert. Anyway, and then that's like where Elrond's house is. It's like the foothills of the Misty Mountains where Rivendell is. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. All right. So
that's pretty good.
Okay.
We're both pretty good. I'm so mad that I forgot. Will you remind me next time?
Okay.
Please.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, intentionally didn't remind you. Well, actually, I can't say next time because on episode 8 in the future, we're not going to do haikus. And then on episode 9, which will be chapter 4, I've already written, I think, two haikus for that one. Actually, one of them is kind of incomplete. So maybe you can help me complete that one when we do episode 4.
That would be fun. Yeah, let me do that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
I'm digging these haikus.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. I mean, it was kind of a little bit silly, a little silly thought at first, but
I think it's great.
Yeah, I think the Japanese were really onto something when they invented haikus.
It's just a neat way to summarize.
And I just think it's appropriate, like when you're reading Tolkien, because he was so into like why people create things into creation,
right,
and creativity that it seems appropriate to when we're talking about his stuff to inject our own little bit of creativity into it.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Anyway.
So now you've kind of hinted at what we'll be talking about.
Yeah, so chapter 3 of the coming of the elves and the captivity of Melkor.
Mm-hmm.
So, what stood out to you in this chapter, Greta?
I was very impressed by Tulkas.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, I was like, when am I going to get me some more Tulkas? And he did not disappoint in this chapter.
Good.
By, defeating Melkor.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was pretty great. You know what else stood out to me, actually?
What's that?
Is the word doom was used a lot in this chapter.
Yeah?
And I know we talked about that at some point in an earlier episode, that it's not really, Tolkien doesn't use it as, he uses it in more than the traditional way that we think of it being used, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel like the couple of times that it came upon, that I noticed it in this chapter, it was almost more, it was used more of, in terms of a destiny.
Okay.
Like, because he talks about, it is doom that the firstborn shall come in the darkness. And it says that the sickle of the Valar and the sign of doom. I just didn't get the feeling that it was being used as like, ooh, dun dun dun, doom. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that stood out to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think doom is just supposed to be. Yeah, I think Tolkien really liked that word, and doom is, I think, just signifies judgment or destiny, or okay. It doesn't necessarily have to have a negative context. It's just like an end,
Right. Okay. Yeah.
It's something that's determined for a figure, Okay. It's like an end that's determined for someone, predetermined.
Yeah.
So it has connotations of like fate and predestination and all those sorts of big concepts.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't even noticed it in this chapter, but I'm sure it's there. I'm just, it's not something I necessarily highlighted when I was reading through it.
Well, they also mentioned a sign of doom, and they mention a ring of doom.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting, and I really enjoyed reading about the elves and where they came from, and how it kind of, because I'm still a little confused about the different. What are they called? The
different groups of elves.
Yeah, the different groups of elves.
Yeah, well, remember, there's that handy-dandy chart back there.
Right, and I did use that, actually. Well, I didn't use that. I used the appendix, I guess.
Yeah, they become more familiar with use. I mean, that's the basic idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it was nice to kind of learn a little bit more about them and where they came from.
I'll tell you, the most central to the Silmarillion are the Noldor. So there's three groups, right?
Right.
The Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri.
Right.
The Noldor are really the most central as a group. The Vanyar really don't play a large role in the story, with a few like kind of minor exceptions, but really the story is about more. I mean, really the story is the story of the Noldor. For now one particular Teleri plays a very important role. Thingol. He's actually,
he's mentioned in the
who's mentioned here is Elwë, but he becomes Thingol, and he's a very important figure. But really, the Noldor are the most important of all. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So we kind of start out, and it says Middle Earth lay in a twilight under the stars. So there's no sun and no moon. There's basically the stars in the sky, and then you've got the trees, the two trees of Valinor,
right?
To give light to the world. And so previously you had the lamps, and they were thrown down. The lamps gave perpetual light. It was daytime all the time, and then they were thrown down. And then the trees are wax and wane, and so they kind of have this mingled light that's not the same as the lamps, because there is actual like night and day during them. It's not 24-hour days, but it's
but
night and day.
There's that period where they overlap, right? Where one is waxing and the other is waning, and that's what creates that twilight.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. A period of extra beauteous period, I guess you could say. So the other part of this is that during this time, all of the Valar are kind of huddled together in their little place in the west, and Melkor has off, and he's building fortresses and building armies of horrible beasts, and there's really only two Valar that travel about. Well, you could say that Ulmo is one because he's the Valar of the seas. He never really liked being at home in the first place.
Right.
But you have Yavanna and Orome.
Right.
The rider and the Vala who loved growing things.
Right.
Living things. So those two are kind of like going about walking about the lands, trying to make sure that Melkor doesn't do too much negative business to it.
Right.
And just kind of keeping an eye on things.
Yes.
And then Melkor, he builds Balrogs. He makes Balrogs. Do you remember what the Balrogs are?
They're...
Do you remember the most famous instance of a Balrog? We talked about this in one of the Vala Quinta episode.
Did, yeah. But no, I can't recall off the top of my head.
Yeah, the Balrogs are...
They're not the Deathy... Oh, I'm confusing Harry Potter.
Oh, man.
Darn!
You almost just mentioned a Harry Potter thing in here.
I did. Dang it. I caught myself, though. That's what's important.
Yeah, well... Oh, man.
They're not the writers. The
That's minus 10 points for Gryffindor.
No!
So Balrogs are like the big demon. So you remember in Lord of the Rings when they're being chased through Moria by that the underground caves by that big thing.
Yes. Yep.
And then Gandalf does battle with that big demonic thing.
Yes.
That's a Balrog.
That's a Balrog.
Right?
Gotcha. Okay.
So Melkor makes the Balrogs. They're kind of corrupted Maya. And he creates them as he says their hearts were of fire. They became like Melkor in his corruption. They were cloaked in darkness, and terror went before them. They had whips of flame. And that's a very similar description to what you find when the Balrog shows up in Lord of the Rings, like kind of the sensation that happens when he first approaches.
Yeah.
And in the movie, it's a little in Lord of the Rings, the depiction of the Balrog it's okay, but it's not quite. It should have been a little darker.
Okay.
Darker with kind of like a fire in the center of it. It should have been like this dread creature, like this like dread that fills everything, like a creature of shadow almost. That's my opinion. But Melkor is just down in his dungeon of Autumno, creating all of these fell creatures, taking creatures that already exist and corrupting them.
Right.
Okay. Remember, because Melkor doesn't work in creating new things; he corrupts things that are already made.
Right. Yep.
And then of course he mentions Sauron.
Yeah.
Sauron.
Lieutenant.
Yeah, Sauron, his lieutenant. So Sauron, bad guy of Lord of the Rings, already showing up here early on, doing bad things at the service of Melkor.
Yep.
All right, so that kind of sets the stage. And then there's this debate. So you remember what the debate's all about between the amongst the Valar?
Well, it says that they basically. Okay, I feel like was there more than one debate?
Yeah, there are actually a couple of debates.
Okay,
so
you know
what the first one is?
Wasn't it to whether or not to fight Melkor, right?
Right. Yeah. Basically, whether they should go out and actually take the war to Melkor before he has a chance. Because at this point, remember, why are the Valar even in Arda?
They're in. Oh, because he destroyed everything else.
No, I mean, like, why do they even descend?
Oh, why do they even descend?
From the halls of
Because
Iluvatar?
they wanted to prepare the place for the children of Iluvatar.
Yes, exactly. And so their concern is for the children of Iluvatar. They're like, well, what if they wake up and Melkor is like in charge?
Right.
And what do we do then?
Right.
So they're having this debate about, should we take
on Melkor?
Yeah.
Like, should we throw the first punch? Basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so they have this debate, and it's basically like, well, not quite yet. It's not really the will of Iluvatar for us to go and take this war to Melkor, like a preemptive war to Melkor.
Right.
And I mean, what do you think about that?
I was a little disappointed because, it seems like, why wait? Why let him continue to create evil and awful creatures? And it almost seems like, just nip it in the bud if you still can, right? I mean, why make it harder on yourselves?
Right.
Because you know that by giving him more time, it's only going to be harder.
Yeah, it's like this is Melkor we're talking about. It's like I'm pretty sure he's planning something bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Why give him more time?
Yeah. And so it's an interesting point, though. But, it seems like they do debate it. And Mondo speaks, and he says, "In this age, the children of Iluvatar shall come indeed, but they come not yet. Mm-hmm. Moreover, it is doomed that the firstborn shall come in the darkness and shall look first upon the stars. Great light shall be for their waning, to Varda ever shall they call it need." And so Varda goes, and what does she do?
She makes stars.
Yes.
Yep.
She does what she does best. She makes stars. And what's interesting about this is that, I haven't researched this, but I think you can liken a lot of these stars to the constellations that are famous to us. Because, again, Tolkien was trying to create a mythology for our own world, right? Especially for England. And so, he speaks of, where is it? Melkor with his shining belt that forebodes the last battle that shall be at the end of days. And of course, that makes me think of Orion.
Orion,
right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think that was his intention.
Okay.
And then the sickle of the Valar and the sign of doom. I think the sickle of the Valar might have to do with the Big Dipper. But if there's anybody out there that knows about constellations and which ones are named which in the Silmarillion, let us know.
Yeah.
So the elves awaken, and by the way, on our copies of the Silmarillion, that's what this image is on the cover here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's an image of the elves awakening by Cuivianen. Yeah, which is far in the east.
Okay.
Far in the east, and remember the Valar, their home is in the west, is in the far west.
Okay.
So it's a good thing Orome and Varda and Yavanna are writing about. And before I move on to that, actually, I thought that little allusion to the last battle was really cool. That forebodes the last battle that shall be at the end of days. I don't think that's a reference to the end of the first age, which is what ends the Silmarillion. I think that's like way in the future, even past the times that Tolkien wrote about. Do you see it?
Okay.
It's on page 48 there. Like where we just read, where it talks about Melkor and his shining belt that forebodes the last battle.
Oh yes, here you go. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I thought that was interesting, and I don't know. I feel like Tolkien had all this other stuff to write about that he never got around to writing about, which kind of stinks. But he probably would have said, well, that gets into our own age, and I can't really write about it because it hasn't happened yet. The whatever. I think I've actually read a chronology, and I think the best people can tell is that we're like in the 6th age according to Tolkien's reckoning or something like that. So,
wow.
Anyway, yeah. All right. So, elves.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about their awakening and what your reaction to that whole situation was, and Orome and his reaction to seeing them.
Yeah, it was they awoke by water, which I thought was interesting. So I remember reading before that the elves had this thing with water, right?
Yeah,
like that's how they would hear their music, and they were just always. Umul was like one of their favorite Valar because he was, in charge of the seas. So it makes sense.
Yeah.
That they would have awoken by water, and it sounds like the way it's written, it just makes it sound like it's just this very peaceful it's a very peaceful time in this very idyllic, untouched environment. And it's funny to think about as opposed to mortals who are born, as babies and then, have to spend time growing into adults. These,
right.
It's like they just woke up from a sleep. And you're like, well, how did they get to Arda in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, where did they come from? I mean, did Iluvatar just, like, reach his hand down and place them there? Or, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, human beings are born, but even in, like, even like the Bible or something like that, like, the first human beings just kind of are put there, right? They're put there fully, as mature, at least physically mature.
Physically mature, yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's true.
So
they came out of something, right? I mean,
well, yeah, but just because, there's a similarity to having been placed there. It's just two of them, like in the Bible, whereas here there appear to be a lot of them placed there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I hadn't thought of that really.
Yeah. And elves still reproduce. They have children in that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, I knew that. Obviously, it just seems like just an interesting kind of.
Well, it is interesting that they're placed in they're in a large group.
Right.
It's not just two of them. At least not that we know.
Right. It was. It was just kind of a weird thing to think about. Like, they're all just here. Like, they, magically appeared. But I did love, I love when it says when Orome happens, I just find it, I picture him, just, doing his thing, just, riding his white horse, just, and bad, the bad cowboy that he is. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, the horse, neighs, and it's, up on its hind legs, and he's like...
Right.
What? And it says in here that he was looking upon the elves, that Orome was filled with wonder, as though they were being sudden and marvelous and unforeseen.
Right.
And it says, for so it shall ever be with the Valar. Which I thought that was really cool. The Valar are always going to look at the elves in that way. Which really speaks, a lot about the elves and just kind of their countenance.
Right.
In their being, because the Valar are Valar, and even they are in awe of these beings.
Yeah, it almost makes me think, and again, this, fast forwarding, traveling to the future in our podcast with Evan, it makes me think of his depiction there of the Valar as being, childlike in a way. That even though they're powerful, even though they were there in the halls of Iluvatar, and they were part of the music of the Ainur, they're still discovering all of these things. And
that's a good point. Yeah.
And so it's almost like here's Orome riding along, and he's got his clothes on, right? Because they put on an appearance that they think is like what the children of Iluvatar are expecting. He's wearing his children of Iluvatar clothes, if you will, and he stumbles upon the elves, and he's like, oh, so that's what they look like. It's almost like they're probably more beautiful than he is at that point because he's trying to he's doing his best to put on clothes that he thought would be like them. But they are fully formed.
Yeah.
They're fully formed
right, they're
beings.
Mature.
Yeah.
They are. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you again, I'll just go ahead and play. I'll go check out Evan Palmer's Anna Lindley comic to see this stuff we're referring to here, and you'll get a taste of this. And the more I think about that, the more I think Evan really nailed that. That how the Valar look a little like, whoa, what are they like? The Valar look a little strange. The elves look like you expect elves to look.
Right.
I think you got that.
That's a really good point. That's a really, really good point.
So. So Orome meets the elves, and you think that all of a sudden things will be just peachy keen, and the Valar and the elves are going to be friends. But of course, Melkor has something to say about that. And what does he do to mess all this up?
He doesn't he kidnap, or he lures some of the elves away, right?
Yeah. Well, Melkor basically says what Melkor does is he starts kidnapping some of the elves,
right? And then he
tells the rest of the elves that the writer is the one who's doing. He starts spreading rumors that
right.
Yeah.
Tries to frame Orme.
Right.
Yeah. So that the elves become scared.
Right.
Of Orme.
Yeah. And they start thinking that the writer and all of his friends are against us and they're out to get us.
Right. So yeah, he's trying to set the elves against the Valar.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's taking those elves and he's making them into orcs,
mm-hmm.
which really made me mad. You think about orcs, and they're like the nastiest, ugliest, like just gross thing. Like that, they are like my least favorite. You know, they are just out of all the bad guys. I think the orcs, like I just can't deal with the orcs.
Yeah, is that a surprise to you? Did you know
that? That was a huge surprise to me because I was like, you think about the orcs just being these nasty, just awful, subhuman.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that they came from these gorgeous, immortal elves, it seems so wrong.
Right.
It just seems just evil, downright evil.
Yeah.
So that was a huge surprise to me. Yeah. Because but now when you think about their ears, the orcs have the pointy ears like the elves do. So now that I know that, I can maybe see some similarities, but, I was very surprised by that.
Yeah, it is surprising, and again, he breeds the hideous race of the orcs and envy and mockery of the elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little strange to me because I always get a little confused by this passage because it's like, well, are all of the orcs from the elves, or did the elves, are orcs just elves that Melkor has corrupted, or did he do that to some elves and then he created his own orcs after that? It's a weird sort of passage for me, and
I thought Melkor can't create stuff, right?
Well, yeah, and so I don't know. I mean, there's a lot. Tolkien talks a lot about how there's lots of things that, he'll make these asides different places where he's like, oh, there's plenty more I could tell you about this particular thing, but or plenty more that could be said about this particular thing, but there's just not space to do so here.
Right.
And that's where his letters come in handy. And actually, I think for a future episode, I'm going to try and do a little more research on that orcs topic, because I know he says a lot about it in different places in his letters.
Okay.
And I just couldn't get my act together on that for this podcast. So
it does say here that the orcs had life and multiplied
after
the manner of the children of Iluvatar. So they could very well have, they all could have come feasibly from ones that were kidnapped, right? Because if they multiplied in the same way that the elves did, it makes sense that could be a possibility. But yeah, that made me mad. And then it says at the end this it may be was the vilest deed of Melkor. And the most hateful to Iluvatar.
Yes, taking what may be the crown of his creation and corrupting it into something so vile and disgusting. Yeah.
That also is talking about the first people in the Bible, Adam and Eve. That's essentially what Satan did to Adam.
True.
Right, Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he took that and not in the same way. Like, he didn't change their appearance, but he caused them to fall from grace. Right.
Yeah.
He corrupted. He destroyed that relationship that God had created, and so definitely some similarities there.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, a lot of. I mean, that's just an interesting topic in and of itself, like the origin of the orcs, and are they really all just elves that have been corrupted? But it's like even so, because then you have to ask the question, like, if an orc is just a corrupted elf, couldn't it be nursed back into being an elf? I don't know. It's all, these are all very meta Tolkien types of questions, and I was beginning to read one of Tolkien's letters where he talks about whether orcs have souls, and he was like, well, souls and spirits and those sorts of things aren't really things that exist in my mythology. Like not in the way we think of them, maybe. Okay. So, like I said, I think I got to do some research on this and find out what's going on. So stay tuned to Talking Tolkien. I'm going to try and do a little more research on that. All right. I think it's good to pause there. Still a lot more to talk about in this chapter, but we're going to do a quick pause and do a commercial, and we will... I'll be right back. Do you know the tale that Tolkien called the kernel of the Middle-earth mythology? Beren and Luthien is the story of an outlaw mortal and an elvish princess tasked with obtaining a Silmaril, one of the holy jewels of the Blessed Realm, from the Iron Crown of the Dark Lord Morgoth. In my new book, Tolkien's Requiem, I explore the legend of these doomed lovers. In doing so, I aim to provide a backdoor into the world of the Silmarillion for those who have struggled to give it a go. One of Tolkien's greatest achievements, the story of Beren and Luthien, deserves to be as well known as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Get your copy of Tolkien's Requiem today by visiting truemyths.org/Beren. That's truemyths.org/BEREN. Happy reading! Okay, and we're back. So we're in the middle of chapter 3. And we've just finished talking about how orcs originated somehow with the corruption of elves by Melkor.
Yep.
And now we're going to get into a little action.
Finally.
Yeah. Finally. Yeah, a lot of the early part of the Silmarillion and then the middle part is very, stage... A lot of it's just stage setting.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like... And it's really interesting stage setting, but there's not a lot of... narrative action like we're used to.
Right, yeah.
But in this chapter, I think the second part, there's a little bit. And so what we have is Orome is being sort of framed by Melkor as this person who hates the elves and is kidnapping them and tormenting them and all this kind of stuff, when really Melkor is the one doing it.
Right.
And so finally, Orome goes to the Valar and he says, all right, we need to do something about this.
Right. This is not cool.
Yeah.
I like these dudes, and they don't like me, because Melkor's making me look bad.
Yeah.
So.
Totally. Making me look bad, making me look like I'm Melkor. And,
right. Nobody wants that.
Yeah.
Nobody.
I'm totally a chill dude.
Right.
Yeah. This Melkor guy, he's just, he's harsh.
Yes, very harsh.
Yeah.
Harshest of all.
And so finally, so he takes this to the Ring of Doom and amongst the Valar, and even Ulmo comes to this. It's important.
I was thinking that. I was like, oh, Ulmo's there, so this must be a big deal.
Right.
Yeah.
And thither came even Ulmo from the outer sea.
I love that. Right. And thither came even Ulmo.
Right.
The guy that never shows up in anything.
That's right.
Is here.
Look who decided to show up.
Right.
Wish you could have been in our last 15 Rings of Doom, Ulmo. Man, maybe we wouldn't be having this problem if you come to the last one and gotten Mandos to actually man up.
There you go. That's right.
But you're off over there singing your sea shanties. Gosh.
Drinking rum. Well, at least he showed up. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Better late than never, for sure. But yeah, I thought it was interesting, this, that Manwë, actually, he, goes and he talks to Iluvatar, right? He actually seeks out the council of Iluvatar.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost like, to me, it was almost like a vision of Moses going up on the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I pictured in there, how Manwë, goes up, onto this mountain, and he, has a chat with Iluvatar.
Goes into his mind palace.
He goes into his mind palace on top of a mountain.
Right.
And he's like, I need your help, Iluvatar. Show me what to do.
And he comes out and he says to the Valar, this is the counsel of Iluvatar in my heart, that we should take up again the mastery of Arda. at whatsoever cost, and deliver the Quindi from the shadow of Melkor. And then Tolkien is like, yes, sweet!
He's like, this is what I've been waiting for!
He's like,
let's
so you're
get
saying
it going!
Can I finally go wrestle Melkor, please?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Ale was not so happy.
Ale not so fond of this because
Which
he
makes
knew...
sense, because he knew it was going to reap destruction over all of his creations.
Yeah, he's like, man, I just finished putting those mountains together, and now we're going to go, like, throw them down.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. Exactly.
But, Tulkas is glad. And when Tulkas is glad, it's like, we need to keep Tulkas happy.
Yes.
Tulkas...
Don't want to be on Tulkas' bad side.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say Tulkas may be like the Incredible Hulk, but not really. But he probably, he doesn't need like any special weapons though. So he is kind of like the Incredible Hulk in that way. It's just like
yeah.
You
can just channel it from inside.
It's like Tulkas smash.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I thought it was interesting too here what it says that so they go to war. They decide to go to war, and it says never did Melkor forget that this war was made for the sake of the elves, and that they were the cause of his downfall. Mm-hmm. It's almost like his great plan.
Yeah, Melkor doesn't forget.
Backfired on him. Right.
Yeah. And we're gonna see what that means here coming up. Melkor, he's a pretty devious fellow, and he's smart. He's really smart, as evidenced by the fact that he, was planting all of these lies about Orome and the rest of the Valar with the Quindi from the very beginning, with the elves from the very beginning. And he holds on to a grudge, apparently, for a long time.
Yeah, apparently, yes. Forever and ever.
So the Valar go and they make war, and like not just the Valar, but the host of the Valar. And it says that the host of the west was swift, and the servants of Melkor fled before them to Autumno. Yeah. And so there's kind of this great battle between the forces of Valinor against Melkor and his forces, and basically like the continents and landscapes are just completely broken by this. And I mean,
which is what Ale knew would happen.
Yeah, this is like nuclear,
Yeah.
This is like whole masses of land being blown up, and crazy. Totally. This is the kind of thing where you're like, this would be kind of cool to see in a movie. Like, I mean, I don't like it. I don't like, I'm not a big fan of movies with just tons of battle scenes, but like a good battle scene can go a long way, and this one would be epic.
That would be an epic battle scene for sure. For sure. Especially this part where it says, then Tulkas stood forth as champion of the Valar, and wrestled with him, being Melkor, and cast him upon his face. Mm-hmm. And he was bound with the chain. I love that the chain has a name. Like, who makes a chain and names it? What's the name?
Tolkien does. Tolkien names things like that.
Oh, man. I thought that was great. I was like, really? The chain has a name? Of course the chain has a name. Hannah, how would you say that?
Angainor, I think.
Angainor.
Let's see here.
That Ale had wrought and led captive. I love like this vision of Melkor having like a dog, like this huge dog collar on, and he's just like
Angainor.
Okay.
AI has the sound of English I.
Okay.
So yeah, where is that? The Angainor.
The chain
that Ale had wrought.
Angainor. Yeah, well, it must have been a pretty awesome chain if it has a name.
Yes,
right?
indeed.
I mean, you wouldn't just name like a dinky little dog collar,
Well, and if it's going to bind Melkor,
if it's going to bind Melkor, it had to be something special.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
So Ale had that consolation as he got to use this awesome chain that he made. You guys broke all my mountains, but at least I get to use this cool chain. Can we at least use this cool chain that I made? Yeah. Well, they're like, throw the guy a bone, or he's going to be unhappy.
Well, we did just kind of destroy everything that he worked really hard on. So yeah, let's use one of his handiworks. But yeah, I just love that image of him just like being led captive, into this great prison. Like like a shameful puppy that's just peed on your couch. It's like,
yes, yeah. That is a cool image.
Yeah.
It is a really cool image.
I liked that a lot.
But they couldn't find Sauron. They
could
couldn't
not
find Sauron.
Find Sauron, and there was still a lot of nasty stuff hiding under the fortresses, under Melkor's evil places.
That's right.
So that's definitely some foreshadowing. We're like,
sometimes
okay, this isn't over.
Sometimes you just can't get the funk out, you know? I mean, sometimes you try to clean
especially
something
when
up.
there's too much of it.
And you're just like, man, we just got to bury this. We just got to bury this.
Yep.
That's what they try to do. So Melkor goes back to Valinor. He's imprisoned. He tries to sue for pardon. Yeah, right.
Right?
It's like,
I plead not guilty.
He's
Come on, guys, let me out of probation, please.
I know I turned the children of Iluvatar against you, and I know I kidnapped a bunch of them and made these hideous things called orcs, and I know I really made Iluvatar mad, and I know this isn't the first time that I've done something like this, but I'm not really sorry about it this time.
You can trust me. I promise. I won't do anything awful ever again.
And, I have a feeling that Manwë was probably kind of like, what do you think, guys? You sound sorry to me.
He probably did. Out of everybody, he seemed like he'd be the one willing to cut him the most slack.
Manwë, and they were most alike in the mind of Iluvatar.
Yes, that's true.
They were brothers in the mind of Iluvatar, but I don't know. We're going to find later that Manwë is not like, I don't know.
Well, I know he's not a pushover, but it does seem like, he's the guy that didn't want to go to war in the first place, right? Uh-huh. So I just feel like he's just a little bit more willing to
it's interesting, to think of Manwë as maybe a little bit of a flawed figure, again, a little bit naive, He's the head of the Valar. He's supposed to be the greatest of them, but he's supposed to be like the high priest of the Valar. He's the one that gets to talk to Iluvatar, and but yeah, it doesn't say that here, but I know later on it talks about Manwë kind of maybe not being as wise to Melkor as some of the others are.
Yeah.
So Melkor gets imprisoned, and he's doomed to abide there for 3 ages long before his cause should be tried anew, or he should plead again for pardon.
Do you know how long an age is?
A long time. It varies, but I have to think that it's a few thousand years, maybe in our mind. Like in the first age, when the first age that officially starts is only like I think it's maybe like half a thousand years, somewhere around there, like 500 or something. Okay. But like the second and third ages are both like several thousand years. Okay. If anybody knows more about that, please feel free to comment on this one or let us know. So then there's what's the next big debate? Do you remember what the next big debate is?
It was about the elves, and it was whether or not they should just let them just kind of wander around and like do their own thing, right? And just be who they're going to be, or if they should bring them over because they were awoke in the east, right, and the Valar in the west. So basically, the debate was: should we leave them in the east and just let them do their own thing, or should we bring them over to the west and have them here to party with us, Valar, right?
Right.
And what I was surprised by was that, first of all, I was surprised that people wouldn't. I don't know. Actually, I can't figure out how I felt about this, but I was kind of surprised. Actually, this was even an argument because it almost seems like, well, they're children of Iluvatar, and we should just let them do what they want. It makes sense that you just let them be. If they want to come, let them come. If not, don't force them to do things they don't want to do. We already know they're scared of Orome, thanks to Melkor. Like, why do anything that might make that worse? But at the same time, I can totally understand the Valar wanting to hang out with them and wanting to get to know them better.
Well, yeah, so they entered into the world for the love of the children.
Right, exactly. So they want to get to know them, and they want to be with them.
It kind of makes me think of this interesting little thread about it's going to come to a much fuller fruition later about like possession, and Olmo is saying like they should be left free to walk about, to go about all of Middle Earth.
He's the freest spirit of all the Valar.
And they should go. And they should be free to just like heal the hurts of the land. Is basically what he says.
Right.
You know.
Yep.
But the rest of them are like, oh, but those poor little elves, they're going to be, you know, at risk and hurt by others, and you know, we don't want to see that happen. And it's like, it's almost like this gathering is this form of possession. They want to be able to have them there, close with them. Mm-hmm.
But their intentions were
good.
Their intentions were good.
We're good, but that doesn't mean that they were necessarily the best. You know?
Well, that's true. I mean, they definitely had some ulterior motives, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's just an interesting little note here, and there's not really an editorial spirit to any of this to say one view is right or the other is right.
Right.
It's a pretty ambiguous decision in terms of what's the right thing.
Yeah.
And you know, you could make the argument. You know, we'll never know what would have happened if they had just left them all there. I mean, plenty stay behind, so it's not like not like all of the elves, every single elf eventually goes to Valinor. Like many, probably a majority end up staying and not answering the summons. But nevertheless, the summons happens.
Yep.
But first they bring the 3 ambassadors.
Well, first let me just comment on this little foreshadowing that's happening again here. It says, once they decided to summon them to Valinor, right? The Valar summoned the Quindi to Valinor. It says that from this summons came many woes that afterwards befell. That's
true. So maybe a little bit of an editorial comment there, but
but also some foreshadowing too.
Yeah, but it's not. Definitely foreshadowing.
Yeah.
I don't know. Again, like I don't know if there's an easy way to say like that would be another interesting thing to look up in Tolkien's letters to see if he makes a comment about that anywhere about whether this was like a critical mistake of the Valar, or if this was something that really they should have done, but it was destined to go wrong.
Yeah, that's interesting. But they decided to bring them, right? And the elves didn't want to come, right? At first it says they were unwilling.
Right.
Right, because they were scared, right? They're like,
yes.
This guy,
Well, and it makes sense because first of all, they had been taught to mistrust Orome by Melkor,
exactly.
and then they had been like they had seen like basically far off like all like the war that the Valar did upon Melkor, and they were like, that's kind of scary,
Right now, they didn't actually see the war.
Well, they saw it from afar off. They heard the thunder,
right?
And
the earth shook, and
like the
like
fire in the skies,
right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. Yeah. So understandably, like they're.
If you're these creatures that awoke beneath the stars, and you're like used to kind of it being kind of dark outside all the time, but just stars lighting everything, you'd probably be afraid of all that kind of stuff too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that would be definitely unsettling for sure. And so, they send Orome right back to the elves, and he chooses these ambassadors.
Yeah.
Right, these 3 ambassadors. Basically, they bring these 3 kind of representatives over to kind of basically wine and dine them, right? And be like, look how awesome we are. Look how beautiful this place is. Now go back and tell your people that they want to come here, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ingwe, Fenway, and Elwë. They bring them over, show them everything. And so this leads to the first sundering of the elves, because so if you refer to the chart there in the back, if you go back to the different elves, you have the Quindi, right? You looking at it?
Not yet. I'm almost there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
You have the Quindi. And then the first sundering is between the Eldar and the Avari. The Avari are those who just outright refuse from the very beginning to go any further.
Yep.
All right. The Eldar are the ones who answer it. And so of those, you have the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri.
Right.
All right. The Vanyar, their king, is Ingwe.
Right. Yep. Ingwe.
The Noldor, their king, is Fenway. And then the Teleri is Elwë, although he has a brother, Olwë, who actually becomes their king later on, as we'll find out.
Right.
All right.
Yep.
So those are the three main groups. And those three groups are called the Calaquendi, the Elves of the Light. Whereas the elves who never come to Valinor and never see the light of the two trees are named the Morroquindi.
Right.
Yeah.
And that includes the Avari.
The Avari.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the Teleri kind of get split into different groups depending on it because they're large. They're the largest of the groups. The Vanyar all pretty much make it to Valinor. Mm-hmm. The Noldor is pretty much the same. And then the Teleri, they're numerous, so it says their numbers are great, so they've got 2 leaders, and then not all of them make it. Some of them kind of fall off as they make this long journey. It is a long journey.
Mm-hmm. Right, well, from one end of the earth to the other, right?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Third Age, they're starting from, even, it's, further east than even, the farthest reaches of Mordor. And that's way farther east than anything ever happens in the Lord of the Rings. Yeah. Definitely farther east than the Lonely Mountain.
Right.
In the Hobbit. So first of all, they travel when they start traveling west. They get to the Misty Mountains, and the River Anduin, and from there they have to go over the Misty Mountains, which are huge, and then travel over another mountain range, and then they're only in Beleriand by the time they get there. Right. So it's they've got a long journey
ends, probably,
ahead of them.
Yeah.
But another note is that each of the 3 groups of elves have one of those have a Valar that they're most close to.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that.
Well, what did you think of that?
Oh, that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
So the Vanyar's people were Manwë and Varda. Mm-hmm. Right, and they were called the Fair Elves.
Right.
So just the fact that Manwë and Varda are their patrons, basically, that makes me think the Vanyar are probably among the nobility of the elves, right? I mean, if we were going to
probably that's probably a good thought.
If we were going to rank them, they'd probably be toward the top of the food chain. And then the Noldor, they were allies, people. And I think it's neat too how they, how they're, and it's interesting, and it doesn't mention it here, but I wonder how these groups got paired with the Valar, because they're obviously their interests or their specialties are very much related to who their patron Valars are, right? I mean, because the Vanyar are called the Fair Elves, right? And you think of Manwë and Varda as being the most beautiful Valar, right? And then the Noldor are the Deep Elves, and they're renowned in song, and they're Aules,
right?
People, and that's obviously a very creative thing, right? And then the Teleri are called the Sea Elves, and it says in water they had great delight. Who is their person? Did they have a
Olmo?
Yeah, it makes sense. It would be Olmo, but I don't see it written here.
Yeah. Well,
it's just implied, I guess.
Yeah, it makes sense.
It does make sense. But I'd be interested to know how, what came first, basically. Were they paired with this Valar, and then that's where their interest came from? Or did they have their interest, and then their Valar stemmed out of that? You know what I mean? Like, what came first, the Sea Elves or Elmo?
Yeah, it's always hard to read with Tolkien, and especially in the Silmarillion, because he speaks to, he'll talk about things, he'll mention something in passing and then come back to that later.
Right.
And he really doesn't tell things very chronologically.
Yeah.
So it might not be so much that they just happen to correspond. It might be that they went there and they learned that that's just kind of who they latched onto.
Okay.
Or who latched onto them, and that's who they learned from.
Yeah, that's true.
But it could be both. It could be a little bit of both.
Yeah.
That Aule, kind of took the Noldor under his wing, and the Noldor happened to really like the stuff that Aule did, and they were like, well, teach us more.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool that they were paired up like that.
Yeah, it is kind of nifty. All right, so
and then it talks about how they split basically into the Elves of Darkness and the Elves of the Light.
Right.
And so the Elves of Darkness, the Morroquindi, they never left. Did they never leave? Or
right. The Morroquindis, some of them make it a certain distance and then kind of fall off.
Okay.
So you have the Avari, they're the ones who never even started out. And then you have, from the Teleri, you have the Sindar and the Nondor and the Lyquendi. All right. The Nondor and the Sindar are going to come back into play. The Sindar are actually kind of important in the rest of the Silmarillion.
Okay.
They're the people of Elwë.
Okay. The Grey Elves.
Of Thingol.
Yep.
And the Nondor play a minor role, but they're not that big a deal. I'm not even sure if the Lyquendi get much mention in here. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we have these various sunderings, and eventually some remainder of the Teleri make it all the way. But even then, they're kind of lagging behind because they are such a big group.
Right, and they're divided into the groups Elves of Light and Elves of Darkness because the elves that don't make it or the elves that don't leave, they're still in the dark, right? Because that's why, because there's no light over in the east. Is that right?
Right, there's not the light of the two trees. That light refers to the light of the two trees.
Right, that's what I thought. Okay, yeah. So two trees are only in the west.
Exactly.
So the elves that do make it over the west are called the Elves of Light because they are now living among the two trees.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. So we get kind of an account of the journey from the east, from the shores of Cuiviénen.
There's Towers of Mist.
Right, there's the Towers of Mist.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool to hear them called out. Anduin, that's that river plays a big part in Lord of the Rings. Kind of cool to hear those things called out so far in advance of the Lord of the Rings, but really they're not very significant geographic features in Eriador is the region that the Shire is in.
Okay.
But really they're not very significant regions in the Silmarillion. Okay. Everything takes place to the west of the Blue Mountains, which are the mountains that are kind of they're like the mountains next to the sea in the Lord of the Rings, where Frodo eventually departs from to go into the west. But over them in the first age, that's where Beleriand is. Past those mountains is where Beleriand is.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah.
So again, long journey.
Yeah. And then what's up with this with Lenwë?
Yeah.
And the Nandor. So he was a guy that was in always group. Is that right, Lenwë?
Yes.
And then it says he forsook the westward march, which means he stopped. Mm-hmm. Right, and he led away a bunch of elves, and they went down. They went south instead of west. They went south down the river. Right.
Right.
And it says they were called the Nandor, and they became a people apart. Are they? Do they play much of a role in the?
The Nandor come back into play a little bit later, but really not very significantly.
Okay.
I mean, they're mentioned a few times, but they're not like. I wouldn't say they're like one of the more important groups.
I see. There they are, Nandor. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Well, so what happens is they all finally wind up on, right next to the sea, and they're like, okay, well, what do we do now? Because we got a lot of people here, and there's no boats. So how are we going to get there?
Right.
So that's where things kind of leave off. And Orome has to go back to Valinor to seek the Council of Manwë and figure out what the game plan is to get them all over there.
Right. Because what's separating them now? The Great Sea.
Yes.
Okay. It's funny that they didn't think of that in advance. It's like,
yeah, right.
You guys are Valar. Like, shouldn't
what,
you?
You guys can't just fly.
Yeah,
what's wrong with you?
You can't just attach your wings and.
I think Orome, the first thing he said when he went back was like, Manwë, you need to teach these guys how to fly. Manwë, you got some eagles that can transport these guys.
Right. Yeah. That's funny that they didn't think of that.
Well,
they were so anxious to have them with them, weren't they? They were like,
we'll figure it out. And again, it kind of speaks. I think it kind of speaks to the night, like to how naive maybe they're a naive streak in the Valar. Yeah. That they're just a little bit childlike. Even though they're great powers, they're still a little bit childlike.
Right. Yeah.
They've got their own maturing process to do.
Yeah. That's a good
which
point.
is really, really a very interesting thing, because you think of them as gods and knowing everything, but they've got their own. They're not mature.
No, they're not infallible the way you expect, gods to be.
Yeah,
that's a neat little twist.
Yes, indeed.
Keeps things interesting.
All right. Well, any final thoughts on this chapter? A lot going on in it.
I really enjoyed this chapter. Yeah, I feel like I read it probably the fastest as I've read any of the other chapters. Cool. Faster than I've read any of the other chapters.
There's a lot of new stuff in it. That's impressive.
Well, and it was just so exciting. Like, I just felt like there was just a lot of really interesting stuff going on, and you just learned so much about, the elves and the orcs and Sauron and, and all that stuff. It was I really enjoyed it. So.
Well, very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on. Still a lot of stage setting. Things are about to get moving, though. That's kind of a little pun, but things are really, like, just in terms of the story are about to get moving, and a lot of interesting stuff is going to be happening soon. A lot of very heavy stuff is going to be happening soon.
Awesome.
Yeah, good chapters coming up. But next we're going to be covering chapter 4, and that's a short one.
Yes.
So might be our record for shortest podcast yet. But it's an important one, a very important one. So glad you enjoyed it, and hope everybody listening listening to the podcast enjoyed it. And thank you for listening. Next up is chapter 4. So, and actually, let me say this: next up for us is chapter 4, but in the crazy time machine world we're in, next up is actually episode 8, which is the interview of Evan Palmer, who created the Einelindale comic that we're so fond of. So definitely listen to that one. It's really cool. And that's actually episode 8. So episode 9 will be chapter 4. So
now that you all are thoroughly confused,
yes,
we will sign off.
Yes, now we shall sign off. After saying we're going to sign off for the last 5 minutes.
Right.
And really dragging it out, which I happen to do a lot.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So what are we having for dinner tonight? No, I was kidding. We're not going to drag it anymore.
Please remember to check out truemyths.org for show notes as well as other Tolkien goodness. On the next podcast, we interview Evan Palmer, the creator of an Einelindale comic. We'll resume our discussion of the Silmarillion after that. Be sure to tune in. Thanks for listening.